jump in because she put us on the 30-foot springboard and said dive. Power and accountability 2024. In some respect, what we're watching is the dissolution of power structure that has existed here for decades, generations. And what we had done for the last 20 to 30 years is try to build systems of accountability for what was a fundamentally flawed system, both in terms of operation and in terms of outcome. And what's happening right now, however, is that system is crumbling because the power that held it together no longer is there. That was the machine. Also tied to the origins of Chicago, its organizational structure, its neighborhoods, and eventually its government, tied to ethnic communities, enclaves, histories, and so on and so forth that were captured by the power elite and co-opted into a machine. Okay? And then they dictated how things went from there. That's no longer the case. What we're watching in real time in our city council, in City Hall right now, is the consequence of the dissolution of that power structure, which is chaos. And what renders that chaos and the outcomes of that chaos accountable? The systems of accountability don't matter so much amidst all of that. It has to come from us. And I'm going to put on the table one very big thing here in that is, and some of the folks have heard me say this already, Chicago is the only major city in the United States without a city constitution.
Wow.
We don't have checks and balances. We have a system that largely has been structured by those that have the power. We do not have the things that we carry in our civic and cultural DNA as to how government should work. And so there was this void that allowed for the capture of the power structures that be, power systems that be. And right now, with the dissolution of that generational sort of system, we don't have a structure, a superstructure that kind of guides and contains us, provides guardrails, provides systems, accountability, feedback loops, the elevation, the availability of information, transparency in how it is that we go about governing that results in the tension of opposites that result in the conversations that are necessary to elevate our policy decisions to be ones that actually serve us all rather than a series of special interests. That's what's going on right now in our city. That's what 2024 is all about. I'm going to stop talking about 2024 and say, therefore, what 2025 is going to be about is how we as a city decide the next chapter is going to proceed. We're in chaos. Chaos is manageable. We have really hard decisions to make. Those hard decisions, each one of them are opportunities to start afresh and anew. But when we focus on the narratives of the past, we have to remember that the systems matter. We have an opportunity to actually decide how we want our government to work once we elevate awareness that we have no structure, that we have no constitutional system, that we have no checks and balances, that we have no equal branches of government, right? Nationally around the country, that's not the case. And in most cities, generationally at most, but more commonly every 5 or 10 years, the city and the people of a city have an equivalent of a constitutional convention. Cities' constitutions are called charters, so they're called charter commissions and charter amendment commissions, where it's written into law that everybody has to come together and talk about how well the government is working and what we need to change about it to make it work better, and to meet the challenges and the needs of changing populations and diversifying populations. We're the only city in the country that doesn't do that. 2025 is the year when we can start to do that, since the power structure isn't here anymore to tell us, can't
If I can chime in, I think also as the editorial representative for a Black legacy publication, we face the challenge of being stripped of having that ability to fully, at least from our corner of the universe, hold these systems accountable. I think all newsrooms, I know there are journalists in the room who can identify with the struggle, but with the mainstream media, what it looks like for you guys, what may be a cold is the flu for us. And having the lack of access to be able to fully hold these systems accountable, to hold the mayor accountable, is a constant fight and a constant struggle for us as well. And when I look at 2024, to me, when we look at this whole system of accountability, we saw that more and more organizations lack the ability to call a spade a spade. We saw that with the presidential election. We saw mainstream publications fail to call a spade with the president, fail to call out racism, and as a result, a lot of disinformation became normalized. But I think in 2025 for the Black press, speaking for the Defender and some of the other entities, I think we have a special opportunity to be advocates. We're not beholden to being merely objective. We're carrying the credo that was set forth by the founders of the Freedom Journal, which is to, basically pursue social justice for us and to speak for us, a community of Black people who often don't get spoken to in the way we're served, the way mainstream media serves the larger cities. So this is a unique opportunity to really outline how the climate will impact our communities, how infrastructure is going to impact our communities, and I would also say the politics as well. So that's my 2 cents with that.
I don't know if I have a cohesive thesis to put forth, but I do think that there's one of the things that I've spent more time at City Hall than I ever imagined I would as a policy analyst. I don't know why I thought as a policy analyst I wouldn't have to do politics. Turns out that's all I do. But one of the things that I'm recognizing, whenever I'm at City Hall during public comment, there is just so much anger and so much frustration that is always present. And I think yesterday in itself was a very strange City Council in that, when I was giving public comment, and it was really surprising for me to see more Black Republicans than I've ever seen, like people wearing Trump hats, and it was just so. They are loud, hopefully a loud minority of folks, but I think that there's this very understandable frustration that exists where it's like the Democratic Party has also not served the needs of Black Chicagoans and Chicagoans generally as well, right? And so there's this very understandable anger where you're like, okay, well then maybe I'll turn to another, and it's like, yeah, but then like Trump, okay, interesting. But I think that in a lot of ways that, one of the things that I recognized in that was that there's a lot of anger present at the current state of just, like, there's no sense of security economically for a lot of people, right? The median income in the city of Chicago for households is $62,000. That was in 2023. I don't know what the updated number is, but it's around 60K for an entire household of people, right? I think it's really alarming when we in just recognizing how many of our communities really truly are often living paycheck to paycheck, don't have more than $1,000 in their bank account, and they are really truly one accident away from facing incredible economic precarity. And I think that anger is very valid, and that then gets funneled into a lot of the specific complaints of the people who gave public comment yesterday was that a lot of money was being spent on migrants and such. And that, I think, in itself is a really interesting, ooh, it's messy. It's real messy. But the fact of it was that there was just so much xenophobia, right? And it's like all of that anger is then being funneled into this deep hatred for people who really truly don't have that much power, right? And also misinformation, where the people were sharing that, oh, they're being put up in hotels. And it's like, do you know the state of that hotel that they put them up in? Those are not functional spaces, right? I live 2 blocks away from a shelter. There's like 1,000 people in an open warehouse, right? It's not the kinds of information that people are receiving about the kinds of money and treatment that's going into helping folks. It's really truly just it's an easy answer, right? I really truly think that that's one of the reasons why so many of these, so much of whether it could be specifically that energy that I think Trump brings, right, is like they're easy people to point to, right? It's easier to point to people and say, well, they're getting it instead of me. It's easier to do that than it is to then take a pause and maybe look at, maybe there's ways that we're spending money that doesn't need to be spent the way that it is, right? And so I think that there's really truly, this budget cycle has been messy and interesting. Yesterday, the city council was stopped because there was a fire that broke out in another room. It was perfectly fine, but that is really truly emblematic of like what it feels like to be a part of city council right now. I feel like is that it feels like shit is on fire. Excuse my language. But you know, there's also this like moment I think that exists where moving forward as people who are part of the Treatment Not Trauma Coalition, you know, there is a lot of thinking. There's a lot of power in trying to lean on the fact that Chicago has a progressive mayor, right? Hasn't resulted in as much as I would like to see, on my own personal opinion. But you know, at the same time, there's a lot of protections in place that can protect us against a lot of the federal mandates that are going to be brought on. I think that there's big questions about what does it mean for Chicago to continue being a sanctuary city. There's a lot of questions about what it means to continue protecting our queer young folks, what it means to continue to provide services to people who are experiencing mental health crises, right? All of those questions are still in place, and there's a lot more hope, and there's so much change that's happening that I think people don't get a chance to actually learn about. But yeah, I'm really curious to hear from both of you, but it's like, this is the different, but like, you know, how do we get our news, right? And then how do other people sort of get their news, and like, how do you know what to do?
Sanya wasn't sure she would have something to say. She told us beforehand. No, she has a lot to say, quite clearly, and I want to just jump on something that pull on a thread that you offered out there, and then to move in terms of the question posed to us. So, the anger is actually a good thing. Got it. The anger is a good thing. People are expressing themselves. That means they still care, and they still think there's a possibility that things can change. The bigger problem that we have is too many people who we don't hear from. 2/3 of eligible Chicago voters did not vote in the last municipal election. 2/3 of them. And so the anger, in one respect, is good. In another respect, it's really bad. Because it's not about a moment in time. It's not about the experience that's being had right now. It's about the fact that it's Groundhog Day. It happens over and over again, and things don't change, and government's not hearing, and government does not respond to the fact that it's been happening forever. That's what George Blakemore's all about. George Blakemore's not talking about what happened to him today or yesterday. He's talking about what happens for generations and getting no response. And that's government, right? And what happens is when people give up, they stop talking. We don't hear the anger anymore. They sort of recede. And the capacity to re-enter and engage is partly a function of the availability of information, how they get their information, what they're hearing, whether or not they're receiving the things that actually would allow them to effectively understand what is happening in government, how it works, and how it actually is almost predisposed towards the very outcome that leaves us all feeling hopeless and angry. For that, we have to turn to journalism. But journalism itself has been captured basically by venture capitalists. Mainstream journalism has been disembodied and reduced to its bare minimum functioning capacity in terms of humans, which itself is being diminished by the introduction of AI, right? And when you have legacy journalism, like Tacuma is trying to hold up right now, that's rendered even more extreme.
Well, she had mentioned at City Hall the anger, and I know you're talking about a very squeaky wheel there. But to answer your question, was it how do we do news? Was that the question? I think there is currently in what we deal with, and I suspect that other organizations deal with this. To use a term by an old Medill professor of mine, it's the vegetables and candy conversation that we deal with. Because we have some of our viewership, who may be more interested in what's going on between Remy Ma and Clarissa Shields and Papoose, and what's going on with the budget and the proposed property taxes. And so the challenge that we have and how do we really do this is that there's an ideal that I want, but then there's the reality. So how do I, as managing editor of this publication, with all this history, bring those two together? And I think the important thing is context. There's always context for me, really explaining and taking the time to break down to people why you should care. Why does this matter? Why does this matter that this proposed, okay, you throw out a big number, $300 million in property taxes. Well, that equates to about what? A $290, $300 increase on my personal property taxes, which further diminishes my income as we're dealing with inflation. So how do we really bring the story home? And sometimes, as part of a lean organization, a solopreneur, essentially, it's hard to, develop the specialty, the understanding and know-how to bring those two things together and to really bring that context home. To really get you to understand that this is important. Yes, Remy Ma and Clarissa Shields and Kendrick's album, that's great, and that's the candy, but how do we really bring these vegetables home that can really educate and empower? And that's an ongoing battle for us.
I think one of the things that I recognize, and I think that a part of that anger comes from this is that it's like, you're just like really tired at the end of your work day. You're working, a lot of people are working ridiculous hours, and then you get home and it's like, I want to turn my brain off, And so like, I kind of like want candy at the end of the day. Like I almost, maybe it's, I know it's not just me because I have seen my friends' screen times, but like, I think that there is this sense of like the things that end up becoming popular and the things that end up becoming circulated, those are things that are a lot easier to consume, right? And the truth is that like, when it comes to understanding what's happening in City Hall, like in the end, it feels really hopeless. It's like, okay, well, all right, fine, I'm learning this. What can I actually do about it, right? Like there's a sense of powerlessness that I think exists for me as like a consumer of media, where I'm just like, man, like I am so overwhelmed by just how much is happening in the world and how powerless I feel against all of that. And I'm saying this as somebody who like is a part of the know-how, right? And I'm feeling this as someone who like knows a lot more about the city of Chicago's policies and laws than most people have the time to, right? Because I literally got the chance to study it in school, right? And so I think that there is also this sense of, you know, there's this mounting pressure where it's driven so much by profit, right? And it's understandable because companies need to be able to survive, to be able to continue to have employees, right? You have to sort of create enough of that like candy so that you have a nice viewership and you have enough people visiting your sites and such. But really when capital is the end all be all that we're interested in, right? How can we increase our capital? And money is really what talks. That's when it becomes really difficult for us to invest in things that are hard and have conversations that are hard and are not going to result in easy answers or people to point to. Those things are the things that I think, those kinds of conversations are the ones that really truly, like, I don't know, I don't have like it's just like when we're thinking about people consuming media, I think it's important to remember this sense of like how do we counter that sense of like hopelessness, right? And how do we get people to feel excited about something that's honestly really boring? Like City Hall is really, really boring and nobody wants to be there. And so it's like, how do we make those spaces feel worth your time and ensure that you do not feel completely like debilitated and like nihilist at the end of like reading up on what's happening. And I think a piece of that is that like a lot of things that are really wonderful don't get as much attention as we'd like, right? Like at Treatment Tacuma, we hold a lot of press conferences and such, but I cannot find a single article then on my newspaper about any of the things that we're talking about, right? Like Pilsen had a new mental health clinic open up. If anyone's uninsured, if anyone, you know, is having trouble accessing mental health, you can go to the Pilsen Clinic, walk in, and get free access to mental health. Like, that is a good thing that is happening, but people who might need that don't know, right? Don't have those resources, don't know those resources exist.
I just promote the concept of transparency. I don't think we have a definition of what transparency is. The government actually makes available a lot of information. There's a lot of public-facing information. There's a lot of data. Some of it is not user-friendly. Some of it is user-friendly. But we've created this compartmented system of transparency in the form of transparency silos. And you have to know where all those silos exist and how to access that, right? And the government gets to call it transparency at the level of a program or at the level of a department, but that's not how we experience life. We experience life across the broad expanse of all that government is supposed to capacitize on the way to us pursuing, with independence and agency, lives of well-being. Our information is not structured for that purpose. The media, the news media, is where we need to go to actually try to identify that information, gather it, analyze it, translate it, and communicate it to us. The cost to carry for you and each of us individually is way too much because of the transparency silos. The cost to carry for media is way too much to bear right now to overcome those silos. We actually need to call on government to achieve transparency in a way that actually is aligned with life as we live it in our needs and expectations of government itself. Otherwise, we're all just chasing after information, which is what we do.
Okay, we've been given the signal to kind of wrap things up. Do we have time for just one more? Okay, you had said something before we began about, what is a hopeful note that we can strike from this conversation, from each sector that we deal with? What would you say? What kind of hopeful note that you'd like to cast for everyone here?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see tomorrow, knock on wood. We proposed a public health and public safety budget amendment where there's $170 million currently that are being used to fund police vacancies. So there's just $170 million that are just sitting there in the CPD budget that are being used for vacancies that they have not been able to fill for the last 6 years. CPD has actually seen a decrease in their overall net number of police officers, and yet they have 1,100 positions open, and $170 million for that, right? And so the goal of that, is to get that budget amendment passed. And I'm going to be perfectly honest with you guys. We'll see tomorrow what happens, but the chances of it getting passed are incredibly low, right? And I think that's where it's and so it's really not that hopeful, but it made it further than it ever has, right? And now it's actually, those kinds of conversations are actually making it to the floor of city council, whereas last year that wasn't even something that aldermen wanted to talk about, right? And so I think that there is this sense of there's a constant push, and I think that a lot of times when policy, I think that there's a thing that I hope for, right? And the thing that I hope to do when I'm writing my newsletter or I'm talking to someone is always to recognize how many resources actually do exist for us to be able to get what we need, right? I think that oftentimes that, and this is a question maybe that I'm posing to you all in the room, is how do we ensure that people know the resources that are available to them, right? How do we make sure that somebody who's experiencing a mental health crisis knows what number to call, so that not police officers show up, but rather having somebody who's certified in being able to respond to a mental health crisis, right? And then how do we ensure that somebody who maybe is uninsured, how do we make sure that they get their vaccines, right? Because I went to CVS and it's like $200 to get a flu vaccine, right? People don't have that kind of money, right? So how do you make sure that hey, if you're a resident of the city of Chicago, you can go to a CDPH clinic, they're all over the city, just look up Google CDPH, or call 311, and you can find your local clinic, right? And so and there's so many more resources. How do we bridge that gap between what people need and the resources that already exist, right? Because I think the more people recognize the resources available to them, the easier it will be for them to recognize what the government is actually able to do for us. And that, I think, is a big question, is what can the government do for us?
Why isn't the government doing more with all the resources that it has? Just very quickly, because we want to find a positive note. That was your call to us. Is the reason that there's 1,000 vacancies that are left unfilled year to year to year is that's what we use to pay for overtime, and that's what we use to pay for judgments in police misconduct cases.
Yeah.
We budget at a very low number for both of those things so that we don't have to be accountable at the front end for what it is that we're actually doing. And then we create these pots of money that can get drawn upon that nobody really understands. We need to understand that, elevate that. So it's those sorts of stories. The work that I do now has a lot to do with budgets. They're inscrutable. They need to be rendered scrutable so that Tacuma can write about it, so that others can read about it to understand that's the taproot, that's the touchstone, and we're not going to have that anymore. Elevate the conversation from there. What makes me positive is this room. What makes me positive about the future is the anger. What makes me positive right now is that there's actual accessibility to forums and mediums for expression. And as long as people keep talking, and we get to the point of more people talking, and eventually the people who hold the power have to listen. And that we can see. And unfortunately, too often it involves a crisis, it involves a common enemy, but if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be. We all have a common enemy right now. It's going to be sworn in the middle of January, and it's going to be put on all of us. We need to elevate the voice because the voice is here, it's in this room, it's in our community, and that's our positive path forward.
That's it.
Another round of applause for them. I don't have a mic to wrangle, so it's really not work with you here. But does anyone have any questions for the panel?
I appreciate y'all being here and talking. I'm just curious, is there a recognition and or a desire to address like progressive elitism and the disconnect between that and the communities that are outside of this space, but not in this place?
Wow.
Just as for more context, for example, you were talking about, folks living check to check. I live in a neighborhood where everybody lives check to check. So bringing up conversations or talks about property tax isn't necessarily going to be the thing that's going to be appealing to those folks. And oftentimes we are in spaces with a lot of folks who feel very, I guess, rejuvenated about, talking about the bad things of the other people, but the other people seem to be exactly the same as the people who are in office now. And so for the past, since Brown versus Board of Education, for example, the achievement gap for black folks has only widened. And so you're talking about generations of folks who have not been able to get access to equal resources or support, whether it's Democratic or Republican. And so when you're talking about folks who are frustrated and angry, a lot of that is not only generational, it's built upon years and years, decades of false promises, lies, and lack of support. And so we are in a space where we are trying to get and rally our base, quote unquote, to go against the orange guy without actually speaking to folks who are impacted by the person present. So just curious what your thoughts are about that. And more so in terms of a media context and how you can relay, or as you were mentioning, bridging that gap between folks.
Yeah, so occasionally I do a radio show. I got to shout out Mr. Darryl Denard. I think a couple of people in this room have been on that show called Chicago Speaks. And there's a considerable amount of people from the black community who felt put upon by the situation with the new arrivals. Why are they getting resources and why we're not getting resources for generations and generations? And that was a very live conversation, a very vibrant one among people that we had to cover, which, that may differ from my personal philosophy, but that's valid because people are expressing that. And so as a journalist, it's even, for me, covering that part of the story, even though it doesn't synchronize with my beliefs, right? So that's one instance. I think also there are lessons learned from what occurred this past election. There was a lot of discourse around the fact that perhaps the Democratic Party lost sight of who they were talking to, meaning those people who weren't progressive, who work every day, who also have valid concerns. So that's something that, as an editor, you chew on. Even from our coverage of the DNC, like what are really people saying in the streets? What are people saying, in our neighborhoods? And I think that we have to do a better job of talking to people, interacting with people, and getting that kind of feedback. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I felt it, and I know what you mean.
Could I just follow up with that? Just quick show of hands. How many people just want shit to work?
Depends what you're talking about, but working means.
The government. How many people just want the things that government supplies to work? Okay? We have agreement. That agreement isn't rooted in politics, ideology, narratives. Sometimes narratives actually limit us. And sometimes the unpacking of the narratives is necessary to take us to really deep down where we come together. And I was in a conversation a few days ago where everyone says, how do we come to understand what we agree on? Which my response was, I'll just be happy if we can find the things that we don't disagree about. There are things that people would be ashamed to admit that they think, right? Let's focus on that. We just want shit to work. That's what I focus on. That's where the anger comes from. Shit not working for a long time has patterns to it. There's narratives to those patterns. But how about we just start demanding that things work? Progressive elite? Yep, we have a progressive in City Hall right now. Things still aren't working, right? We just want things to work.
I want to just touch on that a little bit in the sense that, like, I think that, like, one of the things that I think a lot of it also then requires personal reflection, right? Like, I went to the University of Chicago, right? Like, that, I know, it's, but like, and I did not enjoy my time there, but, you know, this is a publicly recorded, will continue to want your funding and such, so. But you know, I think that there's this very, like, there's a gap, right? There's a very clear, like, the people that you're trying to serve are not, like, again, like, I barely have enough energy to, like, do anything besides scroll on TikTok after I'm done with work, okay? And that is so many people, right? And that is the truth of it, is that, like, and I remember when I'm canvassing in communities for Bring Chicago Home, for example, right? That was a very messy and interesting conversation to have, where a lot of people did not understand, like, the things that you're seeing, the ads that you end up seeing are like, oh, well, this is gonna be an increase in property taxes, my rent might go up. It was not an increase in property. It was not a property tax. It was a property transfer tax, which, again, it's jargon. It is so much jargon. What the heck is the difference? I didn't even know what the difference was, right? But the truth is that that the way that the real estate companies were able to frame it via ads, right, made it seem like my rent might go up. Right? And so I'm not going to vote for this thing. Oh, well, maybe this money is going to go to migrants. Bring Chicago Home was put together by organizations that have been in this city for decades, have been doing this work for decades. This was the culmination of a lot of that work. And yes, some of that, admittedly, like, as a part of that campaign, we could have done a better job of being clear about where the money was going. Like, yes, there are lessons that we have to learn from this. And at the same time, how do we make sure that we're reaching people and not just getting caught in that jargon? And again, the question of who gets campaign funding is a huge thing to answer then, right? Because the truth is that I'm gonna see that ad as I'm just watching TV, right? But am I gonna answer, is somebody gonna answer my door as I'm like, hey, can I talk to you about this thing that's really complicated in the way that I'm using my language? It's a property transfer tax and it'll be over $1 billion and blah, blah. That stuff is confusing, and so I think there is this real gap, and I think the first place it starts is, like, being honest about the fact that, like, hey, I am a part of an elitist group, you know, and being honest with myself about that. Like, I am a college-educated person who, yeah, sure, I'm still, you know, money's still a little difficult, but I don't have to live paycheck to paycheck, and I have to be honest that I'm showing up into this space and being like, here are the solutions. I'm not, no, that's not my place. I don't have the solutions. Maybe I can help ask the right questions, right? And maybe I can provide you with some resources so you can answer these questions yourself. But, like, the first thing to start is, like, yeah, I'm in at least these organizations, right? And I think that there is an unwillingness oftentimes to admit that, right? But if you don't admit that, you're just distancing yourself from the people that you're actually trying to meet. I'm sorry, that was a long response.
Good. Sure. That was great. Yeah, I think one of the things that have happened, and I've never heard anybody say this before, so this is going to be a first time.
And let them hear you do that.
But I think one of the things that we're finding out, especially with in a segment that's growing, specifically in the Black community and some different Latino communities, is that for the last at least decade, 15, 16 years, we've been hearing the word progressive in in Democratic circles, and we've always thought of ourselves as, and we've seen ourselves as Democrats. And Black people right now, in a large segments of this country, are finding out they're not progressive. They're finding out what progressive means, and they're rejecting that because they're not that, right? And the way that it's coming out is, what you're seeing here is, oh, it's this, or the migrants, or it's being called misinformation, or this or that, other. But in actuality, just they're not that. They're not that. They're not in the same place. You're not the same. You don't see things the same. You don't live the same life. You don't know anything about what they're dealing with. And so when we say things like misinformation, and we put that in our stories over and over, misinformation, misinformation, they're like, what are you talking about? Because they live in my neighborhood. They live in all the buildings in my neighborhood. They live in the apartments in my neighborhood. They've got, they're getting their rent paid in my neighborhood, not in a shelter, in my neighborhood, right? And so when we hear those things, we're thinking, oh, they must be mistaken. They got to be mistaken. We, in this business, in this journalism field, we have to take additional steps if we're really going to get the story, if we're really going to be talking to people and speaking to them and what it is that they're going through. We have to start to understand that's really what it is. We have to step out of our progressive lens, which is where we're all very comfortable, because we're all college educated and we're living that life, right? But that's not the life they live. And what their reality is very different. And it's not comfortable. It's awful. It's horrible to listen to. If you've had those people that are there, Jessica Jackson, Mr. Blakemore, he's probably right next door, literally. Walk out this door, go in that door, and go in that door, he's right there. If you meet Jessica Jackson and Zoe Lee and all these people, we've had them come in and sit down. What it is, it's not even about the migrants, quite frankly. They all have a different story. How they got there to City Hall is years and years and years of things that they have been fighting about individually. They have now grouped together and found common ground with each other, right? So it's moving like this Chicago Red, but it's really goes to what he was saying, when the system crumbled, right? And it's been crumbling for, better part of a decade. Things have started to fall apart. And there hasn't been any retribution there or anything to deal with the things that they're dealing with. And so they're angry, literally angry. So us saying misinformation and us saying these kind of things doesn't help the situation, right? And so I believe what you're saying, which is 2025, let's see what's going to happen, right? If nothing else, it's a little bit exciting to watch, right? Because for us who are, I was born in Osteopathic Hospital. It's a condo. Right? So we've watched all the iterations of Chicago, of the machine. My grandfather was a precinct captain all the way down, right? And we've watched us get to this point. So let's see what happens next, but be here to tell the stories, right? And not just the progressive story, but the real stories, because this city is made up of all kinds of people and they have different stories, but very real lives. That's all I have to say about that.
Thank you. We can have one more question and then we'll have you buy more drinks. Anyone have another question? One more question? Go ahead, go ahead.
I'm formulating my mind for a while. I don't know what the question is, but I'll ramble and think of something. I think with this idea.
Ramble quick.
Okay, this idea of uplifting narratives, like a higher thinking of our world in a way that's like deeper, more meaningful, and how lots of folks don't have the accessibility to embrace the resources to figure that out quickly. And this idea of like crisis, and that kind of opens it up to that. With that in mind, we're one CEO down, and that has erupted in lots of narratives about systems that literally kill thousands of people that we pay into every year, and globally countries and slow places have ways to do that differently, and it's been a need for a long time in a different way in the past several cycles, electoralism and stuff, but nothing's happened to be greatly changed. That's since 2010, that was a watered down version, but the Republicans in the 90s. All that being said, how do you use what you consider a crisis moment or crisis or a lived story that deals with violence and power and look at systems and uplift the narrative in a way that's beneficial and transformative to the conscience of how people live their lives and when it comes to life and death and really real issues?
Wow.
We're gonna do a quick,
Real quick.
reaction.
Real quick, those are the stories that I love to do the most. We don't get an opportunity to do them often, and sadly, they're not the most read thing on our site. That's what we're dealing with. But I love to do those stories, and we're going to do them. That's the quick answer.
It's an impossible question. Our job is to leave it to be impossible. And the thing is that look, as humans, we are reactive to what is immediately put upon us, right? And that results in us responding to a crisis simply on the basis of the harm of the moment.
Right.
And not the step back to what brought us to that crisis, right?
Correct.
And so it's a different, and it's a both and, because we have to respond to the immediate harm, the immediate hurt, and we need to sort of reestablish some form of order. But what happens is, and I'll go to a political place, is the liberal view would be the reestablishment of the order means everything is okay again, right? Everything is not okay again. What we've done is we've restored the balance that exists that eventually is going to result in the next crisis. We have to actually have a conversation as to why it happened in the first place, which takes us to systems. It also takes us to narratives. That isn't going to be done by the people in power.
Correct.
That has to be done in other quarters. How that happens, I don't know. I'm one of the older people in the group, right? I'm going to look to younger people to tell me what the language needs to be and what the breakthrough needs to be. But the problem is we just react to the immediate scenario rather than the scenario as something that's happened over and over and over again and that is embedded in the systems and which our systems almost predetermined is going to happen again. We have to talk at the systems level.
I think that the particular response that's existed to the CO shooting, I think, is emblematic of the fact that like we're all angry about the same thing, right? Like every single person feels frustrated about health insurance. There are very few people in the United States who feel good about health insurance, right? And the people who do are making money from that, right? And I think that the things that we are frustrated by and a lot of the actual experiences are oftentimes really similar. Now, where you put that anger and where you put that energy and what you think the solution is different, right? And I think what Trump has provided people is a seemingly simple answer. We're going to blame queer people. We're going to blame migrants. We're going to blame people who are like already on the margins of society, right? Because that is the easy thing to do. It is easier to point that finger and to put that blame somewhere. And Trump has positioned himself as the party that's gonna come and mess things up, right? And the Democratic Party has positioned itself as that of the defender of the way things have been, right? And there is something seemingly appealing about the way Trump is doing things, and I think that I don't think the solution is to do the things. No, don't. There's been a lot of discussions where it's like, do we also then respond in this? It's like, no. I think the question becomes, how do we become comfortable with not having simple answers? And how do we ensure that we do not become pulled in by this sense of like, oh, well then things will just change if we put the blame here. But we've been doing that for centuries in this country, right? And so how do we stop that cycle of just putting blame on other people? And instead recognize that like, hey, maybe this is the moment, right? Maybe this is the moment to be like, oh, guys, maybe we're actually really angry about the people who are making billions of dollars off of like the literal lives that are being taken through the everyday functioning of health insurance, right? Like, oh, maybe there's energy there. Maybe we'll all be like, oh, maybe the problem isn't each other, but the problem are the rich people in power who keep doing things.
If
Two last things.
yeah.
I was looking for it. Swear to God. I was looking.
Olivia's lost the room.
This is where you wanted us to go. So is if the first answer to a situation results in the sense that you've solved the problem, you've asked the wrong question.
Correct.
And I will say, walking up to it, how do we step back? How do we contextualize this moment? How do we use history as journalists to make sense of the moment? Under this assumed progress of an Obama presidency, 2 presidencies, is this kind of like a period of post-Reconstruction, right? I'm just throwing that out there, but again, as journalists and media members, we have a great opportunity right now to not only describe the fire, but to really let people know how it happened and what were the root causes.
Yep.
Thank you.